It seems I'm establishing a little bit of a trend by accident. You see, the last episode of Casey on Cars, I told you it was very selfish because I was reviewing what I very well thought could be my next car. That car was the 2018 Volkswagen Golf R. But I said that there were a couple of problems with the Golf R, and number one was another offering from Volkswagen themselves. That other offering is what you see in front of you. This is a 2018 Volkswagen GTI. So what's the difference between a GTI and the Golf R? Well, the GTI is front-wheel drive instead of the Golf R's all-wheel drive. It's made in Mexico and not Germany, which a lot of people have strong opinions about, and honestly, I don't. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. The Autobahn shares the same option packages as the Golf R in the sense that there is only one option package, and that's what transmission you want. This particular example happens to have the dual clutch gearbox, which we'll talk about, but you can absolutely option a 6-speed manual. There is, however, one major difference between the Golf R and the GTI. And if you watched that last episode of Casey on Cars, you know exactly what I'm going to tell you. Because guess what? The GTI has a sunroof. So the question we need to ask ourselves, and really I need to ask myself, is whether or not the Golf R is worth $5,000 to $10,000 more than a GTI is. And that's a tough question to answer, but let's do that together right now. Under the hood, the GTI is running on a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. When you put premium gas in it, it makes about 220 horsepower and about 260 pound-feet of torque. Interestingly, the GTI does not absolutely require premium gas, but of course premium is recommended in order to get those numbers. As compared to the Golf R, the R has about 75 more horsepower and about 20 more pound-feet of torque. Driving the GTI is, for the most part, very similar to driving the R. As long as you're not trying to do 100 miles an hour out of a turn, it feels roughly the same. And in fact, if you'd like to get an idea of the general driving experience of this car, I encourage you to watch my last video because a lot of it applies. In fact, they're very similar. The differences, however, are obvious, and they're obvious anytime you try to apply a lot of power, even in a straight line in a lot of cases. I've found that when this car is on boost, even in the dry, even in a straight line, oftentimes it's just too much power for these Bridgestone tires. Now that may be able to be solved by a different set of tires, but it seems to me like it's just too much power for front-wheel drive. And that's a real bummer because this car is way faster than I expected it to be, and it would only get faster if it had more grip. In fact, I think that's what still has me longing for the R, is less the power, but more the grip, which is not what I expected. I expected to think that this thing was slow by comparison, and that's not the case at all. It's actually very, very fast. It just doesn't grip as well. This car has way too much power to be a front-wheel drive car, or at the very least, way too much power for the tires that are on it. It just ends up being overwhelming for these poor Bridgestones that are mounted to this particular model. I don't have to try very hard to get this thing out of sorts from a traction perspective. Watch. See? I was full throttle there, but what was interesting was as soon as the boost kicked in, all of a sudden the tires broke loose. You could make an argument that that's actually a tire problem more than it is a car problem. And you might be right. But no matter how you slice it, it seems like it's just too much power for the front wheels. And that's not very fun. It's very attention grabbing to do a burnout. And I did that by just standing on the gas in first. I found that in the GTI, you need to be extremely deliberate about the application of throttle and/or the gear that you're in. But my goodness, does this thing pull? It pulls way better than you would expect. Just being able to toss the thing around, I feel like it's easily as tossable as the R was. In fact, you could make an argument that on paper this should be more tossable on account of it not having the all-wheel drive system to haul around. That's a lot of weight. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't say that it's any more or less tossable. I would just say that it needs to be more deliberate when you apply throttle. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what I was used to in the R, and certainly not what I'm used to from my all-wheel drive BMW either. One thing that the GTI does very, very well is not show a lot of torque steer. In front-wheel drive cars, you end up having a scenario where a whole lot of torque will kind of wrench the wheel in one way or another. And over the years, since the last truly powerful front-wheel drive car that I've driven, which was a Dodge SRT4, they've been able to sort out how to get a lot of power without a lot of torque steer. And I can't say that I've ever really noticed torque steer in the GTI, which is extremely impressive. Obviously, one of the big differences in this particular GTI versus the particular R that I had is this transmission. And I've reached a conclusion about this DSG, this dual clutch transmission, that I'm not entirely comfortable with. You see, I've concluded that if my choices are a more traditional automatic with a slush box, with not the best programming, I would absolutely choose this transmission over that. However, if my choice was between the ZF 8-speed that was in, for example, the Alfa Romeo Giulia that I tested late last year, and this car, I would probably choose the automatic, which is a really uncomfortable thing for me to say. But I feel like this transmission, it tries to be all things to all people, but can't. A great example is if I take off from a light with a moderate amount of quickness, but not full throttle. And what ends up happening is the clutch slips in gradually, and then I get all the power I wanted, which is very frustrating. Whereas in the ZF, it did exactly what I expected it to do. Let's watch. And then wheel spin. So once I finally started to connect, it laid on the throttle, and then I got wheel spin. If I'm honest, it's just not a lot of fun, or at least not for me. And I think that's why I prefer the R so much, is because I don't have to worry about wheel spin in that car. All four tires are pushing the car forward, and because of that, it just figures everything out, as I said many times on that video. In any case, the DSG never really lets you forget that it's kind of a hack, that it is a manual transmission that a computer is controlling. And the ZF 8-speed, by comparison, felt so good and so fast, I oftentimes forgot that it had a slush box, that it had a torque converter. So my uncomfortable conclusion about the transmission is, get the 6-speed if you can, and if you can't, just understand it's not as good as the modern automatics, which is a really weird thing for me to say. One neat trick that the direct shift gearbox or dual clutch gearbox gives you is launch control, which is fun, but as expected, leads to a tremendous amount of wheel spin. I think the most striking thing about the GTI's performance is that you can get more than enough performance for the road for $30,000, $35,000. That's unbelievable value. As always, I put the car in a lift to see what was going on underneath it. In the very front of the car, you can see the automated start-stop system's actuator and paraphernalia here. As we continue down the long axis of the car, you'll notice the lack of a drive shaft because it's a front-wheel drive car. The GTI's fuel tank is also exclusively on the passenger side, and additionally, the rear suspension geometry makes a lot more sense because there's no rear differential to get in the way. Putting the R and the GTI side by side, you can see that they're mostly the same, and there's very few differences between them. I have been hearing for years from friends, from automotive journalists that are friends, that if you're to buy only one car that will do almost everything and do it well, to buy a GTI. And despite the fact that this has been the party line since around the time I was born, I never really wanted to believe it. I'm not entirely sure why. But having had several days of seat time in the GTI, I can tell you they were right. If you want a car that has a reasonably spacious trunk that can become cavernous if you can fold your seats down, if you want a spacious and nice rear cabin, a spacious, nice and well-appointed front cabin, the GTI is probably the car for you. You can get a whole lot of car for a surprisingly small amount of money. And you can get a 6-year warranty, which means that all of my qualms about buying another German car go away. because at least for 6 years, I don't have to worry about almost anything. So it seems then, to answer the question I asked myself from the last episode of Casey on Cars, GTI or Golf R, that maybe the GTI is the winner. Well, actually it's not, and here's why. I hate this car. But let me tell you why. The reason I hate the GTI is because it has exposed the fact that I am not a particularly good driver. You see, I've been driving all-wheel drive cars for about 15 years. And in every single one of those cars, I didn't have to be terribly deliberate about where the wheel was pointed or how much gas I was giving it. It would always just work. And to be honest, that's exactly how the Golf R was. The GTI is a very different animal. You see, this turbocharged 4-cylinder engine provides way too much power, at least for the Bridgestone tires that are on this particular example. Now, I do have a friend with a 2018 Autobahn, not unlike this one, and he's put Pirelli tires on his car, and he has said that it makes a world of difference, and the car is an entirely different animal. However, that doesn't change the fact that you still need to be deliberate with your input for throttle, with your input for steering. It always has to be deliberate. And for better or worse, that's not something I'm used to. So I feel like I have two choices. I can embrace the fact that maybe I'm not as good a driver as I thought, and I can get myself a GTI. I can save a few $1,000s off of the Golf R, and I can hopefully compel myself to become a better driver. Or I can embrace the fact that I'm maybe not the greatest driver in the world and get a Golf R, which is more like what I'm used to, which, thanks to its 4-driven wheels, will sort itself out, as I experienced last month. So one way or another, I still think that I would rather have the Golf R. Despite the fact that you can't have a sunroof in the Golf R, and I love me a sunroof, at least I can have my all-wheel drive. And in both of these cars, I can option it with a 6-speed manual, and I'm really excited about that. So your math may end up different, but for me, I'm standing by my conclusion from last episode that the Golf R is the car for me. One way or another, what a wonderful time to be alive, am I right? As always, thanks for watching.